So I am going to finish the cranial nerves in this video and talk a little bit about neuroplasticity at the end. And if you think about it, I already went through most of the cranial nerves. I went up to the glossopharyngeal. And one of the big things I always mention uh, is to break apart the word. So for instance, you can actually see here gloss. And every time we've come across gloss, it has to do with the tongue. And pharyngeal will be the pharynx, so the muscles down here. So technically, it's a nerve that goes to the pharynx and the tongue. It is involved in swallowing, and it gives you the sensation of taste in a third of the tongue, the posterior third of the tongue. Uh, remember, 2/3 is the facial nerve. So I did want to talk about the tongue a little different than than when I talked about the facial nerve, because what you have is you have the tongue, and you do have these ridges in there which actually give it the ability to grab stuff. They're called filiform papillae. And within there, besides the papillae, you also have areas that have receptors, the taste buds. And you have 5 different sensations that you can have in your tongue. Most of the stuff that we attribute to taste is actually smell, but we can see that you can have the taste of salt, sugar, bitter, which is mainly in the back, uh, or basic, and acidic, and protein, which we usually refer to it as umami or savory. And what we have is the receptors in the tongue pretty much fire, and they go to the medulla. I'm sorry, they go to the midbrain here, and then from the midbrain, they actually will go to the thalamus, and the thalamus will send it to the insulet lobe here, and that will actually let you know what you're actually tasting. The 10th cranial nerve. So before I go, we talked about the olfactory a bit. Oh, the ocular motor, the optic, the ocular motor, the trochlear. We talked about the trigeminal with the 3 branches. We then talked about the abducens, which helps abduct the eye. The facial, vestibular cochlear, hearing and balance. Glossopharyngeal, which we just talked about. And then we end up having the vagus nerve, which is coming off here. Now, the vagus nerve is involved in a lot of different things. And think of vagabond or Las Vegas. Vega refers to wandering, so it's a wandering nerve. It does a lot of things, and it's a main parasympathetic nerve. Now, you do have splanchnic nerves and that actually are involved in some parasympathetics lower down, but this cranial nerve is one of the big ones. It does have a lot of different functions as well. It is sensory motor, so it's both technically. And so the vagus nerve is a main parasympathetic nerve, and it is involved in the vagal reflex, which is a parasympathetic reflex. Parasympathetics is the opposite of sympathetics. So if sympathetics helps you move, parasympathetics will help you relax. It's also involved in moving some of the muscles of the tongue. And so the way a lot of times it can be checked is just by having someone say, ah. The next one is the accessory nerve. Now, if you think of an accessory as something someone puts in a bag or a purse, the accessory nerve is going to innervate muscles that help you shrug your shoulders, such as your sternocleidomastoid and your trapezius. Now, these muscles do have other nerves that will innervate them, but we do check them with the cranial nerves, such like that. And the last one is hypoglossal. Remember, hypo means below, glossal means tongue. So it's a muscle that goes under the tongue, and it's involved mainly in movement of the tongue. And so with that, we've actually have the 12 cranial nerves and how you could check it. If you think about it, smell, easy to check, just have them smell something. Sight, you can have someone read something, and when you do that, you can actually see the superior oblique going around. You can actually see how the pupils react to lights. And when they look up, you can see how the eyes move. So you can actually check the first, second, third, and sixth. The trigeminal, have someone open and close their mouth, the muscles of mastication. It will actually be a way to check it. Then you end up going to the, as I already did the 6th, we can go to 7th, which is facial expression, so smile. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibular cochlear. So if you whisper in both ears, you can actually check the cochlear version, the vestibular, just have them close their eyes and see if they can maintain their balance, but it also is involved in other things. So that would be the vestibulocochlear nerve. 9, the glossopharyngeal, have them swallow, and you can see if that actually works. 10, the vagus, you can actually just have them say ah, and you can actually see if that's working. 11 is the accessory, so have them shrug their shoulders, and you can see if that works. And then you can actually, for the hypoglossal, stick their tongue out and wiggle it around, and you have the last bit of the cranial nerves. Now, one of the things to notice is the cranial nerves are not just checking the nerves, it's checking everything from the receptors all the way to the areas of the brain that are associated with understanding what's going on. And when you're actually looking at overall brain function, it does help to understand the cranial nerves. It also helps to understand where things happen. So for instance, vision and visual interpretation is occipital lobe. You can have someone who can see something, but they may not be able to interpret what they see, and so they may have a lesion in the secondary centers of the occipital lobe. Auditory, you can actually hear, but then do people understand what they're hearing? Word choice is actually another thing. Gustation, it's insula. Can they taste? Do they actually understand that they taste? Smell, we actually talked about the cingulate lobe, which I'll show you here. Touch, pain, pressure, postcentral gyrus, and movement is the precentral gyrus. And so we can see how different areas of the brain are involved in different things. Now, one of the things I would like you to actually pay attention to is something called the angular gyrus. And the angular gyrus is actually involved in speaking. Angular gyrus is speaking and listening, and also reading and writing, depending on what side of the brain you are. Now, in this picture that I found, you have a clear, nice, a really good central sulcus, so you can see the sensory gyrus. You can see the temporal lobe, occipital lobe. And over here, you can actually start seeing different areas that are actually involved in sensation, the angular gyrus here. And if you notice, you have areas in the angular gyrus which are really touching or next to the parietal lobe, which is involved in sensation, physically feeling something. You also have some that's pretty close to the occipital. Occipital is back here, but you can actually have certain things that actually interact there. And of course, the temporal. And so that's why it's actually involved in reading and writing, speaking and listening. When it comes to speaking, it's involved in word choices. Now, this actually will give you the correct word choice. And you do have a nerve tract going from here, angular gyrus, to an area called Wernicke's area here, which is even more word choices. And from Wernicke's, you'll have a tract going to another area called Broca's, which I'll probably mention it later. So you can see here the supramarginal, and it is involved in processing language. The parietal lobe is involved in language, and it is also involved, really highly involved, when you're actually bilingual and language switching. So you can see the angular gyrus and the area that processes language are actually interplayed. They are actually really close together. As we come over here, we can see an area called Wernicke's area. Now, Wernicke's area takes messages from everywhere, and that actually will take it to this other area called Broca's here. And so you have tracks going from these different areas, so you can choose the right words, and you can know what you're actually trying to say. And it goes to the area called the premotor cortex. If you remember, we can actually highlight the gyrus right in front of here, which is a motor cortex, right? And so you'll notice that the area up in front, up here in the blue, is really close to the area for motor control. This area is called Broca's area, and it sends messages to the motor area, namely to the areas involved in movement of the mouth, so you can actually choose how to move so you can say the words. Now, if you can't have a lesion in the Wernicke's area, And if you have a Wernicke's area lesion, I don't know why I keep going there, but the Wernicke's area is here. If you have a lesion in the Wernicke's area, you'll choose words that are incorrect, but they sound properly, and the pattern of the word should be relatively good. If you have a lesion in the Broca's area, you'll know the word that you want to use. Your mouth will actually be able to do all the movements you want, but you will have forgotten how to make the words function in your mouth. And so it ends up giving you a broken speech if you have a Wernicke's area lesion. Now, if the brain is lateralized, the cerebrum in particular, how does it communicate? And it's through something we've talked about before, which is this yellow area here called the corpus callosum. Now, I have mentioned it a few times, and I'm going to highlight it a light blue. You do have a lobe of the brain here coming right over the corpus callosum, which is called the cingulate gyrus. You do have septum pellucidum over here, which is also important. It separates the ventricles, which I'll mention towards the end. And what happens is the right and left side of the brain communicate through this corpus callosum area. Okay. Now, the best way to understand how something happens is to actually use speech. But actually, before I even go into that, I would want you to understand that there's a lot of common sense perceptions that technically are wrong. For instance, the long-term memory are actually stored in both the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes. And short-term memories usually use long-term memory pathways, which are activated by the temporal lobe, and they're only used for a short period of time. Now, there is a little spot in the front of the brain called the frontal pole. So right over the eye, just past the frontal occipital area, and that is involved in pretty much personality. And sometimes in the past, people have actually ripped this area apart to get someone to be more docile. Now, spatial recognition is parietal, which makes sense because it is dealing with understanding sensations. So you actually you determine where your body is based on your parietal lobe as well. Now, the one thing that is really bad is a lot of people tell you, oh, you only use X amount percent of your brain. Truth is, you use every aspect of your brain in various different functions. And if one of them is not working, it won't work. The brain won't work properly. And so how is it possible that someone could say that you only use a certain percentage of the brain when you use all of it at any given time? That actually plays a big role, especially when you're dealing with memory. And so I want to talk about how we make long-term memories. And pretty much the way we make long-term memories is we usually take pre-existing memories and get those pathways to become thicker. The way you make pathways thicker is by making the protein. So you have to go back to the cell, activate the gene, the DNA for that protein, to be able to make the neuron axon bigger. And you can get these axons to split sometimes. And so as you are learning and making memories, you tend to use pre-existing patterns to tell you what's happening. And a lot of times you use these pre-existing patterns, but you also have a lot of inhibitory neurons. About 2 times as many neurons in the brain are inhibitory. And so it uses the same pattern, but it inhibits the pathway that you don't want to use at that point. Now, one of the other things we found is there is an emotional connection to memory. If you have a reason to remember something because there is an emotional connection to it, you will remember it a lot better than if you don't have emotional. You also will notice that any memory you have that is usable, that you're using right away, that tells you, okay, I can see why I'm learning something, it again makes it easier to activate the genes, so it makes it easier to learn if you're active. And so long-term memories and new skills are going to change the brain. And so in many ways, learning new skills, having new memories, it should change your personality a little bit. As you realize that something is not the way you expected, or you learn something new, your personality will change about that. And yet there is something that ends up happening and that people usually forget, and that is, where do the first memories come from? And so with that, I want to talk about mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are pretty much neurons that seem to form the first memories that we make. And the way they work is by mimicking other people. So you see what's around you and you do what other people are doing. If you think about it, if you have a newborn baby who's almost a blank slate, he's going to mimic what other people do. So if someone's smiling around him, he'll probably smile more. If he's listening to something and watching people do something, when they hear something, they will actually start forming those memories. Now, they are most active in younger years, but they do continue over life. And there are some people who suggest that certain types of autism may be linked to some of the mirror neurons. They may be functioning different than in other people. Now, there is another concept that's really important and that's neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that the brain is going to change. So when something is plastic, it's constantly changing based on new experiences and new activities. This continues throughout life. And neurons in the brain seem to compete for function. What I mean by that is if there's an area of the brain that is actually if there's an area of the brain that's not functioning, other areas may actually rewire themselves to get those functions to actually occur. Then the good thing about that is if there's a place that's damaged and there's a lot of neural connections, it makes it real easy for the brain to be able to rewire itself to get those abilities again. Now, again, the idea of memory and the idea of neuroplasticity, the idea of learning, actually goes to everything. You actually do have the basic cell structure and how it's going to make new proteins so you can learn more. The other things that they actually have found is when you are trying to learn, the more aspects of your brain that you use to try to learn something, the more likely that you are to trigger those connections. So if you're actively manipulating something with your hands, you're going to learn certain things a little bit better. If you're talking about it, you're going to learn certain things better. If you're listening, it's going to cause something. If you're watching. Now, if you can use all the aspects of your brain to actually learn something, it should make it easier for you to make the memories that, it should make things easier to remember. Now, one of the things that's interesting is proteins in every tissue are expensive. So anything that's constantly being used or reused will actually get thicker. Anything that stops being used, the proteins will actually start thinning down, which means if you stop using certain memories, certain learning, you will lose those aspects of learning. And so that is actually the neuroplasticity. Now, there is one thing I didn't cover, and that is I did talk about the limbic system. I didn't mention how it's actually used in emotion. I do have labs for it, which are available online. And I didn't talk about the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles are pretty much just holes in the brain, which are normal. And they're actually two on the lateral side, right? They pretty much go around the two lobes of the thalamus. And they're called the lateral ventricles. Within the thalamus, you have a third ventricle, which is called the third ventricle. And then between the cerebellum and the pons, you have the fourth ventricle. Again, these are in labs, and I would recommend doing them so you get a full view of what anatomy is. I hope you enjoy this and have a nice day.